Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be covering the topic of managing training loads, and specifically we're going to be answering the question, how much training should you do? The information presented in this video is not going to be specific to any sport. It's more about understanding the general concepts, and then these concepts can be applied to any sport. I'm also not going to use any specific units, since every sport is going to use different units to measure their training load. So we first need to understand that there are volume landmarks. These are going to be specific points that are going to be important when managing our training loads. So first we need to understand that there is a point where we're doing not enough training to stimulate adaptation. So for example, this could mean simply walking for an elite athlete. While that is exercise, the training is not going to be hard enough to actually stimulate any adaptation and actually improve the athlete's performance. For someone who has been bedridden for 6 months, maybe walking is going to stimulate adaptation because their threshold is so low. But the point is that there is a threshold there where we're actually not doing enough to create any adaptation. The second point is where we're doing enough training to actually disrupt homeostasis and therefore recover and create an adaptation. So if we do enough training that the body actually has to alter its physiology and recover from, we're going to get adaptation. And this is generally where we want to be for the most part with our training. The third point is where we're doing the maximal amount of training load that we can possibly do to disrupt homeostasis and also be able to recover from. So this can be termed our maximum recoverable volume. Essentially, this is the same as point 2, but this is that threshold where it is the absolute maximum amount that we can actually recover from. That leads us into the fourth point, which is where we're doing so much training that we're disrupting homeostasis to a point that our body cannot physiologically recover and adapt to within a given time frame. So if we're doing throughout the week too much training load and we are unable to recover from that, we will not be able to present an overloading stimulus and actually reach the same point of performance as we were in the previous week because we did too much. So this can be visually represented here with this simplified graph. So the first point where we're not doing enough training is here. And this blue dotted line represents the threshold of the minimum amount of training we can possibly do to actually improve performance. Point 2 is where we're doing enough load to disrupt homeostasis and also recover from, and that is really the sweet spot we want to be in. That's point 2 here. This red dotted line represents point 3, so the maximum amount of load we can do to disrupt homeostasis and recover from. So really that's the threshold by which if we go beyond that, we're going to get into point 4 where we're doing so much training that we cannot actually recover from. This is quite a simplified graph. In reality, it probably looks more something like this bell curve here. So on this axis we have adaptation, and on this axis we have training load. So this is how much training we're doing, and this is how much adaptation we're getting from that. Above this line is going to be positive adaptation, whereas below this line is going to be negative adaptation. That's actually detraining and getting worse. Whereas above this line, we're actually getting better. So again, we have similar points to what we had before. When we're doing a low amount of training, it's probably not going to be enough to actually stimulate adaptation. And at that point, we're just detraining. We're not actually getting any better. At this point here, where we're doing just enough training to stimulate adaptation, this is going to be our minimum load required for adaptation. If we hang right on this point here, we're going to be able to maintain our adaptations. Above this point, we're actually going to improve. So above this threshold here, all the way up until this point here, is going to be sort of the optimal adaptive load. So that's where we're going to be able to train and recover and adapt from and actually improve our performance. Once we get to this point here, this is the threshold that we're maximally able to recover from. So once we go beyond this point here, we're actually going to have negative adaptations to our training. So below this point is sometimes what we term as overreaching. And this is where we're doing too much training that we can't actually recover from in a given time frame. Overreaching is generally the term we use for short-term overtraining. So we're doing too much, but we can quite easily back off our training and reduce fatigue and actually have our performance come back to what it was. Whereas if we're chronically training beyond this point, we term that as overtraining. That's when we're doing too much training for too long of a period of time and we actually get worse in terms of performance. And this can take a long time to actually recover from. So in generally, we want to stay in this sweet spot here around our optimal adaptive load. So not doing too much training and not doing too little training. So looking back at this simplified version of our training load thresholds, it's also important to understand that these thresholds change with experience. So if we look at this graph here, this is going to be a beginner athlete. They have quite a wide range of loads that they can recover and adapt to. This is because their minimum training threshold is not that high because they're not that advanced. Whereas a more advanced athlete has a much higher minimum load threshold because they're so much more advanced and their physiology is at a higher level of adaptation. In order to actually disrupt those systems, we need to do more total training load to get any adaptation from them. Thanks for watching and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.